don't have to make sense, we just do them because we do them. What I'm going to do now is introduce Alondra Nelson. And of course, you all know exactly who Alondra Nelson is because that's why you're here. What you don't know is who's the guy standing up there talking to us and standing between us and Alondra Nelson. My name's Don Randall. I was on the faculty here for 32 years. In the history department was Dean of Arts and Sciences and the Provost office. I was the Provost. And in that capacity, I had the great pleasure of midlifing the school's transfer from Dartmouth to Cornell. The school, as I trust you all discovered firsthand, if you didn't know it long ago, is one of the most interesting places intellectually in this or any university. And this afternoon's talk will be a part of that now significant tradition. Alondra Nelson is a professor of sociology at Columbia, and not so long ago elected president of the Social Science Research Council. If you don't know what that is, you should go find out. They do magnificent work on a range of projects. They also do terrific things like give fellowships to graduate students, so you'll want to come up and meet her afterwards and hear them. Her own work, her scholarly work, explores the intersection between sociology and science and the ways in which those things interact with one another. Her most recent book, which has attracted a lot of attention and a lot of praise, is called The Social Life of DNA. And it's about the ways in which modern genetics and the study of DNA has affected people's construction of social and cultural identity, among other things. She also has a marvelous book called Body and Soul, which is about the Black Panthers and Black Panther Party's struggle against medical discrimination. I didn't know, and perhaps you didn't know, that the Black Panther Party created a series of medical clinics and offered free testing for lead poisoning and a series of things like that that afflicted the Black community especially. This afternoon, though the liturgy calls for me to say it, it is particularly absurd. This afternoon she's going to speak to us about moral institutions and racial reconciliation after the Genome. Please welcome Alondra.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here on this tremendously beautiful day. I would rather be outside, so I'm so honored that you would come to spend a little time in conversation. Thank you, Don, for that introduction. I admire so much about Don Randall. What he didn't say about himself is that he was president of the University of Chicago, president of the Mellon Foundation. There's a lot of other things in between. And now I can admire about him that he can also do a beautiful introduction without a single note. There's not a note up here, in case you were wondering. So much to admire. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about my most recent book, The Social Life of DNA, and then a sort of project coming out of that, which looks at the Georgetown University 272. And indeed, Don was, I think, unwittingly prescient when he invoked liturgy, because liturgy comes up. Liturgy at Georgetown, a liturgy of reconciliation, racial reconciliation, comes up at the end of my talk. So I'm going to talk to you a little, just to give you a little bit of introduction about my work. I've been variously engaged in projects, as Don suggested, that are really around the intersections of the sociology of science and knowledge and technology, the sociology of health, although I'm more interested in technology and science and its applications than I am in sort of health sociology. And all of these projects sort of come together to me around this sort of central question. And I feel like all of my work is trying to answer this question, which is how and why do communities that have been the objects of scientific scrutiny and have experienced medical apartheid become subjects and agents in science and technology? So whether or not you are interested in contemporary politics and conversations around sort of the quote-unquote crisis of the STEM fields and sort of the lack of diversity in Silicon Valley or in the STEM fields, whether or not you're interested in sort of improving health-seeking behaviors for marginalized communities who have sort of, in some ways, a rightful distrust of mainstream science and medicine. What's distinct about communities like African American communities is a history of having been the literal objects of scientific scrutiny, right? So it's one thing to say, oh, we need to get more people in the STEM fields and more people need to see their doctors. It's another thing to sort of be instructed to behave in such a way, but have to do so by sort of overcoming a significant, I think, psychic and historical hurdle. And so that for tech diversity conversations in Silicon Valley and for the way that we talk about health and science and other things for me became something I was very interested to explore. Moreover, I'm very interested in exploring how, given that history, given those sort of historical and psychic hurdles, it comes to be the case that there are historic instances in which African Americans use science and technology as spaces of liberation, as spaces for politics and social organization around political concerns. So as Dawn mentioned, I wrote about the Black Panther Party's ability to sort of find a pocket of liberation in health practices and access to healthcare and genetics. And in my most recent work, I became interested in how African American communities in particular find in genetics, which has the most sort of vexed and haunted history of racism and essentialism, a space for possibility and liberation and indeed identification. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this project and then talk to you about the issue of, I think, morality that comes to play, particularly as genetic ancestry testing, as it comes to be used as a political tool, particularly with regard to African American communities, really sort of faces its limits, right? I mean, there's its limits about its ability for a scientific fact actually to bear out justice and to bear out fairness in a society. And we'll get to that at the end. But to the beginning. So this is from the early aughts, the New York Times from 2000. Like many of you, I was intrigued in the early aughts by the emergence of what was then a startup industry, and which is now a cottage industry, $1 billion industry more general, indeed. The sort of emergence of direct-to-consumer genetics as a thing in the world that starts in the UK, probably sort of in 99, 2000 as a commercial industry, and in the United States really begins in sort of 2001, 2002. So as the industry is there's sort of conversations about the industry starting, maybe coming to be, and one of these conversations about this new startup is what the implications of it might be for African Americans. Could it be the case, as was being then just rumored at the time, that DNA may offer a link to African American history, moreover to pre-Middle Passage identity and ancestry, as these tests promise that they might do? So this was at a time when I was just finishing my dissertation, and I set out to wanted to sort of follow this story and this market as it was emerging and this new social practice. And so initially I thought that I was just going to do a set of interviews that would look actually not unlike the direct-to-consumer genetic genealogy television shows that are now also a parallel cottage industry, in which people pose questions about how people felt before and after, and were often brought into the experience of the reveal of before and after. So that was I too was intrigued initially by the before and after, and the kind of sort of metaphysics of that. But soon became clear to me that this was a new market, so there were no customers. So the people I wanted to ask questions for didn't yet exist, and I needed to find them, and I needed to find them as they were crossing over to being customers of genetic ancestry testing. So what I thought was going to be sort of just an interview process or project actually became an ethnographic project, and I found myself in this process joining many genealogical communities. So I joined the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, which has a national body and a Harlem body, and several other organizations besides, and ended up just spending time amongst genealogists. This is from a national meeting of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society in Massachusetts in the mid-aughts, I think about 2007, as a moment where you still had purveyors, you had scientists turned genetic entrepreneurs still having to convince genealogists that genetics was useful for their enterprise. And so you see here, these are all photographs that I took in my fieldwork, unless they say otherwise. African-American female senior citizens, women senior citizens holding a double helix. So this is a DNA 101 presentation at a genealogy conference and convention in which genealogists, people who had in many cases spent decades studying genealogy using family history records and archives, microfiche and the like. This was around the time, actually, my colleague at Yale, my then colleague at Yale, David Blight, said, I hate those people. They're always in my way when I'm trying to get to the microfiche machine. So, these are the pesky people who spend their leisure income, their summer holidays, doing genealogical research. And so then they were presented with the option of the double helix as something that might contribute to this, and had to be compelled that this was the case. This is from that same convening. They're holding up bits of construction paper that represent the nitrogen bases found in the nucleotides that comprise DNA. So it was literally kind of like, this is a building block, this is what DNA is. So my fieldwork took me places like this. You can see from both of these photographs that originally, the sort of original group of people I was spending time with were elders, were African-American senior citizens. Most of them were middle class or upper middle class. They tended to be highly educated. Many of them might be considered sort of club women, so they had been, they were often in African-American sororities rather, and joined clubs like the Lynx and Girlfriends and other sorts of upper middle class African-American sort of communities. And genealogy, in some ways, was a kind of an outcome, another sort of symptom of this kind of a bourgeois pursuit in that way. All right. So as I said, I also joined my local genealogical society. So this is the interior of the Harlem Mormon Temple, the Latter-day Saint Church on the corner of 128th and Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem. Pictured there is the then president of our Harlem chapter of this OGS Genealogical Society, and we were there for a Black History Month event in which African Americans and Mormons, and sometimes those are intersecting sets. Gathered around this idea that you can't know where you're going unless you know from where you've come from, and sort of genealogy and genetic genealogy was a part of this conversation. So my early work was, as I said, as I began to do the work as an ethnographic project, centered on the sort of before and after questions, and a lot of the early work was not, I must say, terribly different from what you see, the stories of revelation, completion, disappointment, and surprise. On these genetic genealogy reality television shows that we borrow almost wholesale from the UK. More kitschily, there were stories like our friend Kyle, who you'll know from one of my more favorite Ancestry.com ads, favorite because it's deeply annoying, in which he begins by telling us that he grew up as a boy always thinking he should wear lederhosen, and then comes to find out that all his life he should have been wearing a kilt, right? So there's certainly this is there, right? In some of my early work, this is an article from 2008 from the Social Studies of Science, in which I was trying to make sense of this, and I was able to sort of write about the transition of African-American senior citizens from conventional to genetic genealogy, and also how they thought about this before and after. But there was a question that persisted, and it was this. I mean, those of you who are about my age or older will remember we had another moment where genealogy was very significant in American society, right? So this was the moment, this is 1976, when Alex Haley's book Roots, the Saga of an American Family is published. It's 1977 when it's made into a miniseries that runs for 8 days on American television. The book becomes an international bestseller. By now it's sold millions of copies. The miniseries becomes a bit like Birth of the Nation, sort of important for visual culture as well, because it was one of the first times that we'd had a miniseries across 8 days in the United States. So it's also significant for televisual history as well as how we think about the history of genealogy. So this is 76 and 77, but by the time we think about the Reagan presidency, I mean, we're no longer thinking about genealogy. You don't really think about the Reagan presidency in that era as being a kind of high watermark. So what happened, why did genealogy, which was a tremendous fad, I mean, again, those of around my generation will recall there were sort of Roots lunchboxes, and you could get these family tree things you could put on your wall, and there were coloring books, like all of the kind of fad kitsch stuff that came with it was part of this kind of genealogy mania in the United States. But in 3 or 4 years, it had subsided. So the question for me became, why Roots hits home now, right? why now, why a market, as I was doing my genealogic or my ethnographic research, why 5 years in, 8 years in, 10 years in, now 15 years into this market, or 16, depending on when you count, is it sticking around? Is it important for American society? Why has it become an important social practice such that it shows no sign of abating, and indeed the market is growing from strength to strength? So I came to sort of try to answer that question in my work. The ethnographic approach that I took up, of course, from the title of my book, of course, borrows from Arjuna Padurai's really important edited book, The Social Life of Things, in which he writes a tremendous introduction that does a lot of work to help us understand both emergent kind of social phenomenon and the way that sort of material artifacts or artifacts travel in the world. And he tells us it's by following them around that we come to understand what they mean in their human and social context. In the field that I most find myself at home in, I guess I found myself at home in a few fields, but in science and technology studies, one of those fields, kind of the social life approach is a very common one. So Sarah Franklin and Celia Roberts take this up in their book Born and Made, which is an ethnographic study of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which, following Padurai sort of insists for us that the way that we can make account of new social phenomenon, new dimensions of new biomedical technologies is through following them around. So that's what I do in this work. I use the social life of DNA to talk about sort of two different phenomenon, a kind of spillover between sites of genetic analysis from genealogical uses to other domains, including forensic and medical ones, as well as to talk about the multiple uses to which one type of genetic analysis may be put to use, in this case, genetic ancestry testing. So there are sort of boundaries around genetic testing, or genetic analysis variously happens in distinct domains and institutions. There are different types of regulatory schema, which I don't have time to talk about today, that sort of regulate or don't regulate the differences between ancestry genetics and medical genetics, for example. And then we can see that the boundaries of genetic testing are really sort of dynamic in the ways that people think about them in interaction. And I'll say just a little bit more about that. So these are what we might think about as the genetic testing domains. And typically, we think about them as scholars and study them distinctively. So a medical sociologist or someone who does medical humanities would be interested in medical genetics and the like. And the domains tend to be sort of very distinct or classified or practiced, or they're kind of a classificatory system that's distinct in the way that we do our scholarship around them. But what became very clear after the advent of direct-to-consumer genetic testing is that these domains will not abide, right? So part of the disruption that is, key to startups in this moment is also about kind of social classification and institutional domains that we typically put around these. So for example, this is a paper from the European Journal of Human Genetics just last year, paternity testing under the cloak of recreational genetics, right? So people are using 23andMe, African Ancestry, the company that I'll talk most about today, and are discovering what's called, among genealogists, false paternity, right? So you have a form of recreational or genealogical genetics that's actually also doing the work of a kind of family genetics that might be used in, say, a family court of law. Similarly, there's the phenomenon of familial searching, in which genealogical analysis is traveling into the criminal justice system through partial matches. So typically in something like a CODIS database, you'll get a match between a sort of a sample, often that's left at a crime scene or suspected, allegedly left at a crime scene, and that's matched to a forensic database. Beginning about a decade ago with a case in the UK, police authorities started looking for partial matches, would suggest that there was a relative, often a sibling, sometimes a close first cousin, that could be matched with circumstantial evidence that might lead to the apprehension of a suspect. So this was the case. Familial searching was used in the BTK serial killer case to close that case, and the Grim Sleeper case in Los Angeles that some of you are familiar with. But there's also, of course, significant, there are downsides here in reasons we can talk about in our Q&A, but there are also downsides in that you're scooping up into these sort of genetic nets members who share genetic information with you who might have nothing to do with the case whatsoever. And moreover, efforts by genealogists often to participate in a kind of citizen science ethos, right? Sort of to use Y chromosome, surname databases, last name databases that allow people to find each other and to use them in an open access way are increasingly, as we know from recent cases like the Golden State Killer case, being used by police authorities. So in this case, this New Orleans filmmaker with the surname Usry, U-S-R-Y, got caught up in an Idaho cold case in which a genetic sample was matched to an open science, open access Y chromosome database for the Usry family, for people who were trying to find each other through their genetics, their shared genetic inheritance. And there was evidence that suggested it was him or his father that had committed this murder. It turned out to be neither of them, but their lives were sort of turned upside down for a couple of years. But this rubs up against another use of genetics that's to exonerate, right? So in carceral communities and carceral societies like ours, it's very important. These are very important stories, the almost 300 cases, successful cases by the Innocence Project that have exonerated people who were falsely convicted using DNA evidence. So you have this whole constellation of both critical uses of genetics, lots of criticism, obviously, to render around the expansive use of genetic technologies, but also a kind of halo effect. So this is someone I interviewed from my work that I call Pat, and she said, when I asked her why she would trust that genetic ancestry testing could tell her anything truthful about her identity, given the limitations of the testing, which we can talk about, given the sort of historic distrust that she herself admitted to feeling about medical research regarding genetics, she said the following: I've seen people let off jail sentences based on DNA. I'm not questioning about DNA given my experiences. There is no reason to doubt the technology, right? So part of what these other uses of genetics do is to cast, in some cases, a halo effect around genetics. So for those of you who work on the sort of social science anthropology of genetics, you'll be familiar with Abby Lippman's concept of geneticization that goes back to the mid-1990s. In that case, she was talking about medical genetics and about the use of genetics in medical settings, and that there was a kind of determinative way in which genetics was used that she called geneticization. So I'd like to put a finer point on that and to suggest that if she's right about geneticization, in this moment it's happening because genetics is planting its flag in myriad social domains simultaneously, right? So we're using genetics in the criminal justice system to correct historical accounts, something I'll tell you about. Also in health genetics and also in familial genetics. So we turn to genetics, it's sort of essentialism, right, is not because of a singular use in a clinical encounter. It is indeed because we're using it increasingly everywhere, every day to tell us things about the world. So I became interested in my work in the particular use of genetics, not for medicine, and not exactly for family history only, right? So as I followed the consumers of genetic ancestry testing, the African-American consumers of genetic ancestry testing, who I should say are the early adopters of this new startup market, which is a point that doesn't often get talked about, right? It also became the case that they weren't only using the genetic ancestry test results for the kind of small family history questions that were often understood that they're about, right? And that they came to sort of start trying to ask bigger questions about the world and about their lives. I came to use the phrase reconciliation projects to sort of try to conceptualize and think about a use of genetic analysis that extends beyond what some anthropologists called humanitarian DNA, although that would be part of this, but extends to just the various ways that we try to use genetic analysis to resolve controversies or answer questions about the past. I also came to think of it not as being the particular preoccupation of African Americans who lament the loss of identity following the Middle Passage, but also to be a kind of world historical phenomena that begins happening in the early 1990s, the late 1980s, as new forms of genetic analysis are made possible, right, in part in the, with regards to the advances made with the Human Genome Project that make possible the ability to use genetics in this way for the first time. So as a case in point, or as a case of contrast and comparison to the African American cases I'll be telling you about this afternoon, we might think about the experience of the grandmothers of the May Plaza, a social movement in post-Junta Argentina that begins in the early 1980s, working with the geneticist Mary Claire King, who comes to work with them to help find their grandchildren, right? So you'll recall in this case that the authoritarian government disappeared the activists and often with their children as well, and placed the children in the families of their allies, right? And in some cases, women were brought to effectively concentration camps, allowed to give birth, and then their children were placed in families of those allied with the government, and the mothers were disappeared. So you have a group of grandmothers who have the conviction that their grandchildren are living, and sets place which is now a 3-decade-old social movement to find them. And up until, I think, even last year, they were still finding some of these grandchildren. So I wanted to understand that use of genetic analysis by Mary Claire King, who's a pioneer in breast cancer genetics and helps to locate the marker for the BRCA gene, breast cancer gene. That use of genetics with other uses to sort of attempt to resolve, right, endeavor to resolve social issues. So then I was able to then place my particular interests in a kind of valence of reconciliation projects that really are about endeavors to resolve injuries produced by racial slavery through the use of genetic analysis. So to put a finer point on this kind of reconciliation project really becomes how the use of historical genetics spins out in the United States in a significant way. So if we think about the comparison of the UK, we think about a geneticist like Brian Sykes, who at the University of Oxford, or he was for many years, he comes to work on things like the case of the Tsarina, the Russian Tsarist family. There was a woman who had claimed that she was the last Tsarina of that family. He analyzes her remains in order to answer that question. Brian Sykes would also analyze the remains of sort of ancient remains like Bogban and other sorts of remains and the like. So that's what's happening around the same time or a few years before in the UK. In the United States, we have this, a 1998 paper in Nature, Jefferson fathered slave's last child, right? So as soon as one can begin to imagine using new genetic analysis to answer not only medical questions or not to do clinical medical research, we in the United States are asking questions about the history of racial slavery, right? So this paper uses Y chromosome analysis to trace Jefferson male descendants and to try to answer this question, a question that Annette Gordon-Reed answered in 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning books, but yet we still needed genetics to tell us something more about it. All right. So I'm going to tell you now about the African Ancestry Company, which is the company that I came to study most in my book, in part because it starts in 2003, and it's one of the very first in the United States, right? So the early adoption story about African Americans with regard to direct-to-consumer genetics is not only about the consumers, but also about the purveyors. This company starts in 2003 when there were 4 direct-to-consumer genetics testing companies in the United States. Among them was Family Tree DNA. Of those 4 companies, only 2 still exist today, Family Tree DNA and African Ancestry, right? So it's a pioneering company, and it's a long-standing direct-to-consumer genetics company that comes online 5 years before 23andMe, the company that we come to understand as sort of really embodying what this industry is. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to study this company and Rick Kittles, but by so doing, I also want to tell you about how I came to understand in this space how it could be the case that African Americans could use genetics to think that they could do something liberatory. And this story that I'm going to tell you about the African Burial Ground, which is now a national monument in Lower Manhattan, I think offers some answers, or at least a way of beginning to understand how this might be the case. So some of you will recall this story. In 1991, the General Services Administration decides that it's going to put up a federal building in Lower Manhattan. It's going to house branches of the IRS and other federal agencies. The building is supposed to, they do some historical mapping, they look at some historical maps, and the suggestion is that where they want to put up the building would either be on top of or next to a historic burial ground that was called the Negroes Burying Ground that dated to colonial era New York City. So as a Southern Californian, I found it amazing. I still find it amazing. As coming from a place where you can hardly dig in your backyard without having a whole cultural resource management team, an indigenous observer and the like, that one could think that you were going to put up a building on top of a cemetery and still proceed. But this is what happened in New York City, if you could imagine, in 1991. So you won't be surprised to hear that what was imagined as a construction site soon became an excavation site because it was indeed sitting on top of a cemetery, the Negroes Burying Ground. So a group of researchers called the Metropolitan Forensic Anthropology Team, or the MFAT team, is brought to excavate and analyze the remains. The MFAT team at Lehman College is effectively a kind of CSI laboratory. They're not academic researchers, they're not academic biological anthropologists, so they were not particularly interested in the historical significance of the remains, the material culture that might have been buried with them, or anything about the funerary culture or the burials that might have been instructive about the lives of enslaved Africans in colonial era New York. Indeed, their questions were really about, was the answers to the sort of classificatory questions, like, is this a black or Negroid femur? How many centimeters is it? How much does it weigh, right? It was a very kind of gross classification. So there was lots of controversy at this site. Some of it was from a group of people who were spiritual activists who did drumming visuals and candlelight visuals and just wanted the souls rested and this excavation stopped. And then there were people who understood this to be a site of profound historical significance, but thought that Lehman College was doing it wrong for lots of reasons, because they took this deeply classificatory approach, because they were later accused of not using the conservation methods that were required to really preserve these remains and the like. Among them was an African American biological anthropologist named Michael Blakey, who was then at Howard University running the Montague Cobb lab there, and now is at the College of William and Mary. So he publicly accused Lehman College of reducing the individuals in the burials to narrow typologies and thinly descriptive variables that disassociated them from their particular culture or history. And putting a finer point on this were a group of activists, a social movement, I write nothing without social movements, that call themselves descendants of the African burial ground, right? So we're in the early days of doing analysis on these remains. We don't know then whether or not genetic analysis could be used to even give us some very broad strokes about who these people are. And so, I think it was profoundly strategic that you've got activists calling themselves the descendants, and in that way saying that as descendants they have rights over, at least ethical rights, if not legal rights, over the disposition of those remains, right? So this is a social movement claim. So they put a finer point on Blakey's critique and said that classification of the African burial ground remains being carried out at Lehman College amounted to the biological racing of their ancestors' bodies, right? They said that they opposed merely descriptive frameworks that would reduce their ancestors' social identities to skin color, right? So here is a critique of scientific racism and a critique of biological racing, kind of a gross classification. But they didn't want that for the science to stop. They thought that scientific analysis could still be done on the remains in such a way that provided a more fulsome understanding of who these people might have been. So the project is moved from Lehman College in New York City, which is, I think, a principally Hispanic serving institution, but I think in this political context sort of served as a white institution, moved to the W. Montague Cobb lab at Howard University, right? Historically black institution. So there's a kind of institutional identity politics happening with this change in part. But it's also significant for lots of other reasons. So Montague Cobb was one of the first African-American biological anthropologists in the United States. He was also a leading member of the NAACP and wrote in NAACP publications an anti-racist column called The Integration Battlefront. So he used his tools, much like Du Bois, as a scientist to rail against scientific racism. So the movement of this project, right, to a laboratory, an anthropology laboratory at Howard University named for him, brought that symbolic history with it, this kind of anti-racist science with it. So the project that was carried out at Howard University was a biocultural interdisciplinary research strategy, which is the phrase used by the researchers, okay? And you'll note that it was multidisciplinary, and that included both social science and the natural sciences, and humanities, depending on how you classify history. But you'll also note that it included this research strategy carried out by a multiracial but significantly African-American team of researchers, what in other contexts we would understand at the bottom as Exhibit A and B of scientific racism, craniometry and molecular genetics, right? And indeed, Rick Kittles, the African-American geneticist that I showed you earlier on, and I'll show you again, was then a graduate student in genetics at George Washington University, who comes to, as our graduate students do, bring the new knowledge and the new techniques to the project to try to advance the use of then nascent molecular genetics to say something about the origins of the people who were buried there. The implication here on behalf of the researchers, or what the researchers wanted us, the outside world, to understand, is that biological racing or scientific racism comes from the use of one of these alone, right? And saying that these answer the question, where are these people from, or who are these people? And wanted to suggest to us that you could use an approach and a hermeneutic that layered these together, in which one of them said who they were, but all of them offered a way to layer various ways of thinking about the identity, with none of them holding the definitive answer about it. So what was at stake when I talked to the activists and the scientists for them, and I'm going to put scare quotes around both of these, was a transition from race to ethnicity. And we can have a long conversation about that, which I'm happy to have, but just ride along with me for a while. So racialization, if we go back to the historian Michael Gomez's concept, for him and for me, you might think of as being a transition from a socially stratified, ethnically based identity, right? That is available before the Middle Passage, directly tied to a specific land, to an identity predicated on the concept of race that becomes the only identity available to enslaved people after the Middle Passage, right? So race as a caste and as a social status is created in this transition, and which Gomez calls exchanging their country marks, right? You exchange your country marks, which in the United States context is how one can render identity, for caste and for race, okay? Which has meant for African Americans that we've been denied what Mary Waters, the sociologist, called ethnic options, right? And we can talk a lot about symbolic ethnicity and how it's symbolic and performative and not real, but what remains true is that that form of symbolic ethnicity is sort of an entree into what it means to be American, right? Variously. So up to this point, as Waters would remind us, that African Americans were highly constrained to identify as blacks, right? As a caste, as a race, without other options available to them, even when they believed or knew that their forebears included many non-blacks. Okay. So Rick Kittles, let me go to this one first, comes out of the African Burial Ground Project with the technique that he used there and creates a commercial company called African Ancestry. So the technique that he uses there is the creation of a reference database of contemporary African DNA. And then he matched what they were able to get. Ancient DNA analysis was very elemental, it was very basic at this time, so I think it was about a dozen remains in the end that they were able to significantly amplify and match to this reference database. And the inferences that they were able to make were very broad. They were sort of Bantu-speaking region, Gold Coast and the like. They lacked specificity. But he took that technique with some controversy on behalf of the other researchers and brought it into the commercial sphere, creating African Ancestry, co-founding it with a woman named Gina Page, who studied economics at Stanford. So what do you get from African ancestry? You get ethnicity and you get a nation state. So I should say what's true of all direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies is that they have to make meaning-making part of what they do, right? What a genetic ancestry inference is a set of genetic markers. Zero, depending on how you do the test, haplotype groups. It's nothing that makes sense to a person who's not a scientist. So all of these companies, 23andMe, when it comes out with a kind of social network and Web 2.0 way of doing data visualization and also connecting people in a community, for African ancestry, it's a certificate of ancestry that renders all of this data into ethnicity, the Temne people, nation state of Sierra Leone, right? We can talk about this. All of these categories are constituted by scientists and people working with them in laboratories. I mean, we are doing things like saying, 12 markers is Sierra Leone, right? So there's lots that we can say that's critical about this, and we can have a conversation, but I just want you to bear with me, we can get there. And indeed, this is a short piece that I wrote with some colleagues in science from a few years back that really goes into all of the criticisms that one can render about the science and business of genetic ancestry testing. That's available not behind a paywall, and I will point you to for a more fulsome critique of the genetic ancestry testing industry than I can provide here. So, in the course of my work, I came to study these reconciliation projects, and moreover, what I write about are the reconciliation projects that sort of bloom out of the services and the inferences of the African ancestry companies started by Rick Kittles. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Isaiah Washington. I won't have time to tell you about a slavery reparations case in which genetic ancestry testing appears, but I can talk about it in the Q&A. So in the valence of reconciliation projects that are around the history of racial slavery, they're used to do various things, including a sense of restoration of African identity and ethnicity lost during the transatlantic slave trade, a sense of reparations or repay or restitution, and reunion, a reuniting of a DNA diaspora or DNA networks. And I will tell you a little bit about some of these. So I found myself in 2008 on the banks of the Ashley River just outside of Charleston with a group of about 25 people who called themselves DNA Sierra Leoneans based on genetic ancestry testing. One of these was the actor Isaiah Washington, who in 2004 was one of the very first consumers of African ancestry's direct-to-consumer ancestry tests. He had received the test kit as a gift. He had won an award at a Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles, and that was kind of in his swag bag. He took the test, was linked to Sierra Leone on the mother's side through mitochondrial DNA analysis, and from that point forward referred to himself as a DNA Sierra Leonean, as did two dozen other people that day. So we were a group of about 35 people, and they were there to do carry out a traditional Sierra Leonean ceremony called a Sara, which is a ceremony of remembrance to rest the souls of ancestors who've been lost. That typically happen at 1 year and 7 year intervals in Sierra Leone. So in this case, you have people who have descendants, or ancestors lost centuries ago, who are turning to a Sierra Leonean ceremony of remembrance that they feel is made available to them now because of this genetic analysis, right? So the way that we often talk about, if we think about Michael Dawson's work on linked fate, the way that we also talk about the sort of politics of diaspora, particularly in the Black community, is that it's a political identity and people, don't have any kind of specificity, and so people have lived out that kind of politics, and that remains true and will still be true. But what genetic ancestry testing allows is something like a threshold into a ceremony like a Sara for people who feel interpolated into a kind of identity that makes this possible. So what's also interesting here is that there are other people who have different relationships to Sierra Leone who also feel interpolated and were brought to this ceremony. The woman in the purple is from the Polite family, P-O-L-I-T-E. She is the great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of a little girl named Priscilla who was trafficked from what is contemporary Sierra Leone to the Carolina Low Country. And it's one of the few African American families that know their pre-slavery ancestors based on slave manifests and slave ship manifests and historical records. And the gentleman in the purple shaking Isaiah's hand is a gentleman named Amadou Masali, who had come to Charleston from Dallas. He was an immigrant from Sierra Leone. He's now immigrated back to Sierra Leone. And he was the officiant or griot of the Sara ceremony. So this site on the Ashley River was significant because it was the site of at least 2 very large slave auctions that took place at what was then called the Ashley Ferry Landing from Bunce Island and Sierra Leone. Masali had soil with him that day that he claimed was from Sierra Leone that he cast into the Ashley River. This gentleman, a DNA Sierra Leonean, put a reef in the river to rest the souls there. And there was a kind of poignant moment here for Isaiah. So again, there's no real reason why any of these people couldn't have done the ceremony before, but the genetic ancestry testing offers a kind of new basis of affiliation that provides a threshold to social practice that people didn't think they had access to before. Another reconciliation project involves the life and legacy of Leon Sullivan, a Philadelphia-based Baptist preacher, pictured here in the middle in the dark suit. You'll see next to him is Martin Luther King Jr. He was a civil rights activist, and he in later life became a sort of black power through black capitalism type of fellow, such that he would come up with Sullivan principles, which are still taught, these business ethics principles that are still taught in business classes today. And the Sullivan principles were developed as a way to come up with ethical principles for multinational corporations operating in apartheid South Africa. It's a very kind of problematic legacy, to say the least. So like many Christian preachers, he had messianic visions that he documented in 2 of his memoirs, but his visions were about the African diaspora. I had heard and heeded a call from God and from Africa and from African Americans and others of the black diaspora to try to unite people of African heritage with Africa, to make a link, to build a bridge. This is really embodied in a series of biennial gatherings that he calls the Leon Sullivan Summits that start in 1991, which include participation from Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz from the World Bank, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and the like. So it's very much American, US elites and African elites on the African continent gathering around the potential for social and economic development projects. In 2008, the summit passes a resolution that it's going to encourage African Americans who attend to decide to use genetic ancestry testing, and then based on these testing outcomes to do targeted or niched social and economic development on the African continent, right? As opposed, again, to sort of saying, I feel a sort of kinship with Africa and I'm going to make some investments there. And moreover, I'm an entrepreneur and I'm a capitalist and I want to make some money there. This offers an opportunity to use genetic ancestry testing. You'll see in a collaboration with African Ancestry, their logo there at the bottom, to bear this out. So the hope for outcome for some people who were not sort of, the larger, the sort of big commanding entrepreneurs here was a form of DNA citizenship that was made possible to Isaiah Washington, who in 2010 received dual citizenship in Sierra Leone. So we can't know whether or not it was his celebrity or his DNA test to Sierra Leone that sort of won the day, but the case remains that he now has dual citizenship in Sierra Leone, as he narrates it based on his genetic ancestry testing outcomes. And this is the hope for, at least symbolically, if not actually, outcome of many that I spoke to. And indeed, when I took this picture of Isaiah's passport at an event we were at in Atlanta in 2010, and I said, he'd only had it for about 5 months, and it was totally dog-eared, and I said, why are you carrying this in Atlanta? And he said, these are my freedom papers. And I think that a lot of people who do genetic ancestry testing have something like that in mind. So, I told you about a few reconciliation projects, but they're very vexed. I mean, this won't be true for everyone. The technology on which they're based are shaky. The claims on which they're based are shaky. The inequalities that are foundational to the work. I mean, the sort of contemporary African reference databases that make possible bourgeois African American identification is vexing. The sort of heteronormativity of genetic ancestry testing, which assumes, families are only mothers and fathers all the way back in time. There's all sorts of things that one can say. And for these and so many reasons, these reconciliation projects are, as I used the phrase deliberately earlier, endeavors. They're attempts to sort of resolve things that can't effectively be resolved by science. So I use in my work a term called transscientific. The chemist, physicist named Alvin Weinberg used this in 1972 to say that there are questions which can be asked of science and yet which cannot be answered by science. I propose the term transscientific for these questions since though they are, epistemologically speaking, questions of fact and can be stated in the language of science, they are unanswerable by science, they transcend science. And I would add a finer point here, which is that these are often questions of morals and of social justice, right? And so that there'll never be a scientific fact, I think, that can bear these out. So I want to switch now, as I promised Don Randall I would, to liturgy. So I've been following in the last 2 years, the case of the Georgetown 272. 272 formerly enslaved people who were owned by the Jesuits of Georgetown College, who were sold down from Maryland to Louisiana in 1838 to keep the school solvent. Georgetown, like so many other institutions, has engaged in a process of uncovering the history of racial slavery at that institution, but has had a different approach for lots of reasons that we can talk about and that I'll share. But the high watermark of this different approach was a liturgy of reconciliation that took place last April at Georgetown that included descendants of these formerly enslaved people that were sold by the Jesuits, members of the Jesuit community, Georgetown alums, and current Georgetown students. So you'll recall that this sort of drumbeat around institutions of higher education and reconciliation, or at least conversation around racial slavery, really began in the early aughts. Particularly, they start with Yale University, a group of graduate students there, but as an institutional endeavor, they began at Brown University, right? Under the presidency of Ruth Simmons, who in 2003 forms a committee to investigate Brown University's ties to slavery, and the report is issued by this committee in 2006. The report shows, among other things, that Brown did indeed benefit in its early years from money generated by the slave trade. For the purposes of our conversation today, I was particularly intrigued in the report by the discussion of the two Brown brothers, right? John Brown, pictured with the shorter hair, and Moses Brown, his brother. So they were both slave traders. John was a more avid slave trader. Moses, with the long hair there, would convert to Quakerism and become an abolitionist, right? So by the time Brown University is founded, you have two brothers, one a slave trader and one an abolitionist, and a family. And James Campbell, the historian who was then at Brown and is now at Stanford, and in part of the report, says that the brothers posed for us a kind of quandary for us as a nation, right? It illustrated the moral choices within a historical context that two different brothers had, right, to make about the peculiar institution. So as I said, Yale really begins this. This starts in 2002. Some graduate students involved in the Graduate Student Union there release a report. Brown is the first sort of power of an institution, a presidency or a provostship to move forward with an investigation into ties to slavery. University of Virginia now, more recently Harvard, and more recent still Georgetown. And I should say now that there are so many institutions, I think 30, more than 30, that have engaged in this kind of excavation of their slave past, these institutions, that there's now a consortium of institutions, right? There's enough that there's a consortium of higher education institutions. Okay, so some of you know this story. Georgetown has a slavery memory and reconciliation project. Alums, faculty, students excavate this history, which was kind of known, but not publicized or widely known, and release a report saying that, yes, this happened in 1838, and that it's a shame, and these sorts of things. But, what they didn't count on is this fascinating alum named Richard Cellini. So Richard Cellini appears in the archive in the New York Times as early as the 1980s because he's been railing against the trustees of Georgetown for 3 decades now. So in the 1980s, he was complaining that the Board of Trustees was there were only Jesuit members on the Board of Trustees and that alums should be allowed to join the Board of Trustees. But effectively, he's been a kind of muckraker at Georgetown his entire alumni tenure. So Cellini says, it's actually not good enough, certainly in 2015, after all of these other institutions have been doing this, to just say we had some people and we enslaved them. He said, we're the descendants, and he said, we can find them. So the Georgetown case is distinctive because Cellini hires genealogists to find the descendants of the GU 272, right? So this is another reconciliation project. He says these are real people with real names and real descendants. And he starts a nonprofit called the Georgetown Memory Project in 2015 to find the descendants of Isaac Hawkins and other of the GU 272. Some of these descendants include, genealogists include the woman in the foreground. Her name is Judy Raffel, who works with a team of other genealogists who know very well the Louisiana genealogy records, which are Catholic Church records and slave ledgers and the like. The woman at the top pictured in the green is also a professional genealogist who happens also to be a descendant of the GU 272. So there's this sort of phalanx of genealogists that go out to find descendants. Folks who think they might be descendants or can find themselves, who think they might be descendants are invited to sort of submit now to the Georgetown Memory Project or to these other associations like the GU 272 Descendants Association, a pedigree tree of their genealogy, but also a DNA link, right? So soon after this starts, genetic genealogy becomes part of the project of reconciliation for the GU 272. Ancestry.com is the sort of holder of the genetic genealogy records, and it's also the case that these open databases, so this is the database, like a similar Y chromosome database that was used in the Usry cold case that I mentioned to you, right? So there's real sort of danger, even as there's sort of possibility for folks who want to use this. So this is the sort of the DNA of descendants of Isaac Hawkins, who was the kind of patriarch, if you will, of the GU 272. So there's been sort of many stories here about people who are finding their descendants. There's a few hundred of them now, and there's estimated to be somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. Many of them are in Ascension Parish in Louisiana. And in fact, about 3 weeks ago, there was many of them came from all over the world and all over the country to tour their sort of homestead in Louisiana. And Georgetown offered an edge, as they say, in admissions to descendants of slaves. So their form of restitution or reconciliation was legacy status for the descendants. If you've been following the Harvard affirmative action case, legacy status can be a profound thing. Although the descendants here actually think that, are not all convinced that this is what they want, and they feel like they weren't asked what they wanted as a kind of restitution or form of reconciliation. Many of them are saying we don't want reparations, but someone should have asked us would have been meaningful for us. Cellini, again, because he's such a muckraker, puts a finer point on it. There was a lot of stuff coming from the university about plaques and commemorative songs and plays and the script of the campus tour. It's not trivial, but it didn't strike me as central. So Cellini, as well, is sort of pushing the institution to do something more. And this liturgy mass, I think, is something that's part of a Jesuit tradition, was part of that something more, but we've not seen the last of this. So I'll just end with one last quote, and then I'll be happy to have conversation, which is from Didier Fassan's really wonderful work on moral institutions and moral economies. I've been very interested to think about the kind of nice reversal that he offers for us, right? And certainly in the sociological literature, we think about something like the church as being a moral institution, and we understand that kind of morality as being inherent to the institutional structure or the organization itself, right? What Fassan offers for us is something more like what we see with the Brown brothers, right? That moral institutions or institutional morality is a choice that institutions can make, and that one can make a choice to say, oh, we found this history of racial slavery, or one can make a choice to use genetic genealogy to uncover the descendants of these formerly enslaved people. He reminds us that moral economies and that the choice to have institutional morality as a dynamic for an institution of higher ed, a religious institution, and others are connected in the daily activities of institutions through the values and affects which crystallize around social issues and the responses that are given in concrete situations. Thank you very much. Sure. Yeah, me too.
The floor is now open, and she will call on questions.
Yes, Avital.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to also thank you for introducing perhaps a back channel also of combining some of Nietzsche's genealogical probes that try to disclose what's a driving force behind certain quasi-historical and certainly scientific endeavors, as you say. And his concern with, though his is a question, he didn't want to be associated with mere man and was dynamite. His concern with the scientific getaway plans in a certain way. So I wasn't able to fact check what I'm going to ask you, and you can certainly dismiss it. But recently, apparently in the very considered and coded white royal family, African-American signifier was introduced in a grand wedding, incompatibles apparently, and the Queen is said to have put a stop to the nasty undertones by saying that according to her genetic results, she has an African background herself, and that kind of is another almost positive blowback maybe. Whether or not, I look to you for a reading of that, or is it a misappropriation, or is this a great moment where who would have expected Queen Elizabeth II to run away with something and make it stick in a shocking way?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had heard parts of that, but not in quite that way. I mean, I guess a couple of things to say. One would be that, that genealogy is a royal tradition, right? I mean, it's a biblical tradition, a rabbinical tradition, but it's also a royal tradition. And part of what's happening in the US in the 1970s, Matthew Fry Jacobson writes about this in his book, Roots to TOO, is a kind of democratization of genealogy, making it available to non-royals in a profound way. There's also, Francois Weil has a wonderful book called Family Trees that also is kind of tracing this history as well. So I think it's sort of doubly or more deeply significant that a royal would sort of make a pronouncement about genealogy in that way. So I'll say that to start. And I guess, I mean, what else to say? The other piece I would say is that as much as I took seriously how the people that I spent time with for a decade took seriously genealogy, it's also the case that it is it's this kind of meaning-making practice that can mean anything, right? So she could have easily have deployed that same genealogical evidence in myriad other ways. And so part of what's interesting, I took a slide, I usually show a slide of like a pedigree tree, but if you, that I took down in the interest of time, it's about really it's always about making choices about how you want to narrate the past and how you want to deploy it in the present or the future. So any of our given pedigree charts, like if you think of them as being, us are here, and then it sort of goes up and there's all these people in here. What's interesting about genealogy is that the ego, the genealogist, is making a choice about which of these lines to follow. So, there could be lots of not interesting people over here. I mean, you see it really played out in the genetic genealogy television shows in which, a producer or Skip will troll back through somebody's past and find the one person that offers you this sort of Jungian coincidence. Like, of course you're a celebrity. Your grandmother was Sarah Bernhardt, because we're just talking about our friend Sharon. You find that kind of one person out of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000s that makes sense. And so, genealogy is also that. And it gets sort of played out differently with the genetics because, admixture testing gives you percentages of, Neanderthal, Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Eastern Europe, and all of those open thresholds to different stories and different social practices to the ego who wants to use them or not use them. So I would just say that she made the queen made a choice about how she was going to deploy her genealogical facts. Yeah, Heather.
Thanks so much for the talk. And I guess, just to pick up on this question about the kind of flexibility of genealogy or of the Genome Project. Politics are could go in any direction. So I'm interested in that question and kind of the main way that you framed your work about how much these kind of methods can be appropriated and what's involved in these kind of retaking of science and technology, basically. Because, and I think it came up around the biological anthropology moment, right, and the critique of the Layman project, because, when you put craniometry up there, it really seems to be testing the limits of, a kind of method that we can only really think of kind of horrible uses for it, right? And so I guess, it seems to be like a basic STS question about how much do the history of the deployments of a particular technique or method kind of determine its future uses, right? And so, I think it's an interesting question for you, working with a fairly problematic technology or kind of history of, in its history of racialist science. So, but I think can we see a future in which craniometry could be redeployed? Because also ethnography has a similarly kind of vexed history, or taxonomy is taxonomy, bad because it's been used in these ways. So I'm just sort of curious about how you think about that question of how much the history of these methods kind of determines their use in the future. Do you see it as more open-ended?
Yeah. I think I was trained. I'm I'm a Troy Duster student, so I was trained in very much a way that was the history is deterministic in that if the internet comes from DARPA, that's all it can ever be. I'm also an Andrew Ross student, so it means and though both those explanations are not satisfactory to me, so I'm not ready to swing the pendulum all the way the other way and say that that the history has no shape, does nothing in shaping these technologies, but I'm also felt particularly with entering into the work around the Black Panther Project, what are our choices, both as citizens and as scholars? So if my choice is going to be I used my dear friend, the title of my dear friend Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid, in the beginning of my talk. So the subtitle of her book is A History of Medical Experimentation on African Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. So it's 400 years, right? And it's a 400 and some odd page book. It's a magnificent book, but also not a single page of that book says that Black communities had anything to say about this, right? There was no contestation, there was no protest, there was no politics of knowledge, there was nothing. And I just actually, knowing what I know just about the sort of 20th century history, 19th century history of African Americans, I know, that's not a satisfactory explanation. And so I think one that says that these things determine those things doesn't allow us to sort of say, people were in a corner with their backs against the wall. How did they try in this moment to sort of navigate and make sense of, of these things? And so, again, I'm not trying to say the history is broken free from it. And indeed, what I like so much about the descendants of the African burial ground as a social movement and other people that I spoke to is that they invoke the history. Indeed, Rick Kittles, when he talks about when he was sort of drumming up business for customers for his business, said, I know, instead of sort of saying like things are different now, things have changed, he would talk in front of rooms of hundreds of people, many, mostly in the early days, African-American women, senior citizens, and would say, I know all the reasons why you wouldn't want to use this technology, right? Because I'm like you, right? Like, so I know about the Tuskegee experiment, I know about the Holocaust, I know about, scientific racism. I see that Montague Cobb here is holding calipers, although that's not a human skull, right? So he just made it all sort of like hyper present in his presentation of the work. And I think that also makes a difference as well. But the danger is profound. And you see it in the forensic uses of the technology. You see it in, ripped from the headlines, the fact that sort of beneficent 23andMe has sort of come to save the day and is going to reunite the children with their parents who are, the refugee children from South America. I mean, that's appalling. But what to do with that? I mean, it might, we know critically that, families are more than bio-kin. We know that this administration has manifestly created a human rights disaster. And do we use that technology or do we not use that technology to find the parents? I'm not sure what to do with that, right? And that it's part of the question. I mean, I do think if they're going to do it, you have to say to 23andMe, you can't take this data and iterate it back into your database, which is their business model for pharmaceutical patents. You'd have to destroy it. I mean, I think that there's a way to do it that is more of a humanitarian DNA, but a conversation needs to be had about what those limits are. But I think the danger is baked in, and we can't kid ourselves that you can get away from it, but that I think that you can sort of work around it and through it. A gentleman there.
Thank you for this great talk. I've been interested for a while now about sort of high-profile academic institutions using things like genetic analysis to find descendants of people formerly enslaved by those institutions and thinking about that as a form of redress. I guess I'm just curious if there's any larger conversations pushing back about how that limits the scope of redress. For example, in the case of Georgetown, yes, it's interesting that you're able to find the ledger of, okay, yes, the Jesuits did sell those slaves, but even if they hadn't sold those slaves, they didn't necessarily need to sell slaves in order to benefit from the institution of slavery. I mean, even recent work from someone like Edward Baptist demonstrates how slavery is what made capitalism function in the first place. So whether you sold slaves or not, if you were an academic institution at that time, there's probably some blood on your hands. And the ability to claim redress just for the descendants and to be able to have to say something like genetic testing is required to receive that redress seems like a way to kind of narrow the question down from larger social justice questions on a structural level. So I don't know if there are any comments.
Look, yes, exclamation point. What is there to say? You've said it all. It does limit the scope of redress, but I think I would just say, to play the devil's advocate, because I totally agree with you, is that it creates a scope for redress, right? I mean, I think that, when we live in a society of amnesia, and, part of what I try to write about, probably not as successfully as I would have wished in this book, is that at a moment of sort of the high watermark of colorblind racism, that genealogy is a tool that allows you to say, this happened. This racial travesty, this racial, transaction, this chattel slavery system sort of happened. And so it does, so maybe we would say not creating the scope, but opening a conversation for redress that might have otherwise been ignored or sort of bypassed. So, but I think that everything you said is exactly right. And, part of what some of the descendants community at Georgetown is saying is, is exactly what you're saying. It's like, does this stop what the university's obligations are? And I should say, Georgetown, did not support this nonprofit for the genealogy, and nor is it supporting, the Ancestry.com testing. But it's part of the dynamics that are now part of this. Where I thought you were going initially, but you ended up going somewhere else, was about. I mean, there are complexities around the testing, I think even if the tests are donated by Ancestry.com, which I don't think they are, I think people are buying them, these are not, even as you're trying to get redress, they're not, as I was talking about the sort of the refugee children who are here, are seeking asylum, like it's not a situation in which the company is saying, we understand this to be a reconciliation project or a project of redress. And because of that, we're not going to try to sell you on our subscription model, which is what Ancestry.com does, and we're not going to keep your DNA in our database so we can iterate out more on this precious African-American DNA, which we have all too little of, and both our commercial and medical, databases, right? So that, that sort of, is a way to sort of think about how to push a conversation about redress. Like, what is the obligation of these companies, and is they're engaged in these projects as well? Yeah. And then we'll go.
So I had a question which is kind of piggybacking off of Heather's, and then also kind of a more anecdotal one. And so the question, I think, is really, knowing the work of Dorothy Roberts and other people who are very much more critical, and not that you were not in your own ways, but just thinking about there seems to be two things that you do differently, which are quite interesting. One, it's much more an ethnography of how this is used by communities and not about kind of macro institutional structures. And so I was curious in terms of a groundswell, if there were other, and maybe in your current research, if there are moments of resistance, right? These are kind of celebratory, using these technologies.
These are celebratory?
For
I find them actually very sad. My book is very sad.
Okay. Well, at least providing a scope, right?
Yeah, okay.
At least there's this maybe not self-critical, but at least self-conscious use on behalf of people in the community that this might be useful.
Sure.
And in some cases, it might lead to achieving concrete rights, whether it being a passport or whether it being, permissions, etc. And so I'm just curious in terms of the concrete mobilizations, which I think are very hard to do against certain kinds of genetic testing, or against the ways that these companies are housing information and distributing it and reselling it. Mm-hmm. And then the other, the anecdotal one is among you and other starting sociologists of science, if many of you have done your own genetic tests.
Yeah, great questions. So, I made a decision to me that was really ethically really important with this project, which was that I wasn't going to do a lab ethnography, which is how we typically talk about genetics and STS, or anthropology or sociology of science. And I actually wanted people to talk about why they were making these very tough choices. And everyone I talked to understood that they were making a tough choice. So no one I encountered took it lightly that they were sending tissue to a company, right? And some, moreover, as I write in my book, knew that they were sending their tissue to Sorensen Genetics in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is a Mormon family-owned company that then sends the data back to Rick Kittle's company or to other family tree DNA for analysis. Like that, there was this whole kind of sort of ecosystem that was very sort of troubling. But there were people making sort of cost-benefit calculations, and this is how they came up on the other side of it. I would also say, and this is related, as you said, to Heather's point. All of the stories that we have about African Americans and technology are stories of the kind of resistance that you want to hear, right? But there's lots of other things happening as well. And if we really actually want to understand the lived experience of Black people, we need to tell all of those stories, right? And I'm sad to be the only one telling these other stories, but I refuse to sort of have the only ethnographic experience that we have of Black people to be like ghetto ethnographies or ethnography. Like, there are myriad other stories to be told. So, and I a little bit I disagree with Dorothy. So it's funny. So I wrote this book with Beacon, and I had a whole sort of section where I was engaging Dorothy's book, and Dorothy engages some of my work in her book. And my editor was like, no one cares. Like she highlighted all of this stuff in yellow. She's like, all that stuff in yellow about Dorothy Roberts, like no one cares besides you and her. Like, take it out. So I ended up taking it out, this engagement that I think academics care about, but I was trying to reach a broader audience here. But I think, for me, I often offer back to Dorothy, like the conundrum for me is that like Dorothy cares a lot about social movements, but she doesn't care about these social movements, right? Because they're not, for her, it's like, Right. And I refuse false consciousness as a diagnosis for people who are early adopters, who are longstanding reparations activists, and who within a year of a new market use that technology to advance a reparations class action suit. Like, to me, false consciousness is not a satisfactory explanation. So we don't have to like it. I mean, I have a good friend mine is Jacqueline Nessie Brown, and she was, we did an event together, and she started just saying like, people can't think that, and then later she said, I can't believe I'm yelling at your informants. And I was just like, what do you want me to say? Like, this is what happened, I don't know what you want. So I think, certainly there could have been more points, I think, in my book where I said, people shouldn't think this about race. But but we need to know that people think this about race, right? And part of the reason that we are, I think, in a kind of, grief/trauma around the profound failure of racial liberalism in this moment is because we actually haven't had honest conversations about what all people think about race. And I think, and I would say, I mean, I think one of the wonderful, most beautiful engagements with my book is one by, they did a forum on my book in Somatosphere, and Jessica Marie Johnson wrote a really nice response. And when she really, I think my book is really sad. I think that my book is about people who have given up on the possibility of advancing racial justice in other ways and turn to a vexed technology that has been deeply problematic to communities of color for centuries as a way to try to get around and through. To me, that is not a celebratory story. It's a deeply tragic one. Yes?
So thank you so much for an incredible talk. I mean, maybe related to the tragic part of that and connected with the question earlier, you raised the question about the scope of redress, right, and how is that potentially limited. But I wonder too on the side of responsibility. And sorry, I also missed the first couple of minutes of your talk, so apologies if this overlaps with what you already said. But I was recently watching Finding Your Roots, and there was that whole scandal around Ben Affleck.
Yeah, I read a little bit about it.
Turning out to be related to a slave trader, right? And then when the show came back on the air, now they seem to make an explicit point of dealing with connections to slavery, regardless of who the guest is, right? So one that I saw was Larry David, right, who has these sort of deep roots in a Brooklyn Jewish community that turns out he has this Alabama ancestor who owned slaves and so on. So, he wrote a piece about that was, both comic and sort of amusing, saying, I used to think I was one of the victims, and now I realize I'm one of the perpetrators, right? And there was this sort of transformation of worldview. But, related to your question, I mean, do you need to have an ancestor who's a slave trader to have responsibility for the legacy of slavery, right? And so I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously there's a small number of celebrities who are tested on a show like that. But what's your sense of the impact that this kind of testing, especially in these well-known examples, is having on discussions about responsibility, about reparations, however one understands that?
Yeah.
If you don't turn up an ancestor who was in the slave trade, are you off the hook? Or, is it actually making people more broadly aware of the implication of slavery in that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I hadn't used the word responsibility, but I think that's true. And I didn't know the Larry David, what came after the show at all. So I'm glad to know about that. Certainly it makes the history of slavery for those who find themselves on either side of that equation less abstract. Part of the narrative of colorblind racism is, I didn't own slaves, my grandfather didn't own slaves, it happened so long ago, get over it, right? And so what Ancestry testing allows is a kind of telescoping in of that history. It makes it very personal, it makes it about somebody someone is a celebrity, Larry David, or somebody in your community who will talk about it. So I think that there's that piece of it. But to go back to, I think, what I said maybe in response to Avital's question, I mean, even with that, it remains the case that those are choices that are being made about what ancestors are important or not important, right? And so, all of us have, those of us who have a kind of American story of recent vintage, of more distant vintage rather than recent immigration, have part of that story, I think, and on both sides. And so it's also really about how we, in this moment, are willing or not willing to narrate and choose what lineages, which genealogies are important. And gosh, I was going to say one other thing about that. Yeah, I mean, I think that in the Affleck case, it was true there as well. You know, I mean, why? But, you know, and here in this case, you had the choice of the producer choosing not to tell the story, but there was also a choice made about, other ancestors could have been chosen, and someone chose that lineage and that ancestor to follow, thinking it would be good television and good narrative for this particular audience in this particular moment. What else to say? I mean, the other thing I was going to say is just about the sort of sheer numbers, the numbers game of genealogy, which is that, the farther back in time you go, there's actually smaller ancestors than one would think, and people are intermarrying closer than one would think. And so this is why you get things like, if you'll remember from around the Obama, the 2008 campaign, there were these sort of stories that would come out that would say, George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Barack Obama all share the same like great-great-great-grandfather or something like that. And that's just because there's just less people in the world intermarrying. So there's a way in which, all of us ultimately are kind of interrelated, and the way that we choose, there's a, Evyatar Zerabavel at Rutgers has a really nice way of talking about choices in genealogy that are around cutting, and I mean, he uses all of these pruning, all of these sort of like gardening sort of metaphors to talk about the cognitive, strategies around how we choose ancestors. And I think that, that's true even in these cases. There was somebody over here. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Really great stuff. And I want to go from the question of choices, because I'm curious within the texture of your informant, if they talk about the feeling of shifting of how morality itself can be inherited. So in the sense that it's not something just passed down or comes from the immediate institution of the family, but that you get these weird kind of new connections. And I say this as having this weekend found that through 23andMe that I actually come from a really religious background in a way that I didn't like. I am living this right now in a way.
Okay. What's your moral choice? Do you dare to share?
But just in the sense of if that is a way of rationalizing, actually opening up two different kinds of moral structures that actually kind of move away from more familial logics.
Yes, I love that. So I don't know if what I had in mind didn't move away from familial logics, but one of the things that's become interesting is that, particularly with infrastructures like Ancestry.com, is that, and 23andMe does it as well, is that if someone is related to you, right, and what cousins mean on genealogy sites is a whole other conversation, but if someone is related to you in it's sort of second or third degree, and this might be what happened to you this weekend, sort of you get pinged and they'll say, this person might be related to you. And so what's happened with some of the folks that I've continued to stay in touch with, although this happens after I do my work, with African American genealogists, is they will often find a relative of European descent. And that person can choose in this, web social media space to open their tree up, either their genetic tree or their pedigree tree, to this person or not. And so, people have avatars and photos or whatever, and so a lot of the African American genealogists say, this person is of European descent and they're not going to open their tree to me because they don't want to deal or reckon with. So, for them, that's a moral choice, and someone's making a choice not to deal with, their kin because of the kind of valence of racial slavery in a way that's I thought was interesting. That's my kind of a first reaction to your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question regarding kind of the fatedness of the subjectivity that these genealogical tests provide, right? So you look back into your ancestral tree and you connect, like you were saying, oh, this person was an actor, so therefore I am this, or like these great people were connected to this ancestor, and so therefore I am this. And I think there's a sense of fatedness that precludes futurity or radical futurity, and that's like why Queen Elizabeth would go back in time and say, oh, I actually have African ancestors, and therefore I'm actually not doing anything radically different in the future because, they're an institution that wants to like promote the past, and if she was actually gesturing to some sort of radical inclusion, she'd be undermining her own kind of institutional work. And so I guess I'm interested in relationship to your work. You talked about the kind of ultimate tragedy of these people and the sadness of it, and I guess to me that's tied somehow to the fatedness of a sense of recovery, rather than a sense of like radical possibility or like the temporal shifting that goes on there that kind of limits certain things.
Fascinating question. You know, I don't know that I totally agree. I feel like that some of the people that I talked to and encountered, I think you see it a little bit on some of the genetic genealogy shows with African Americans, feel like their future has been forestalled because they didn't have this question, right? So I don't know that they're imagining a kind of, you know, a radical futurity, but that they felt like a kind of future was denied them because they did not have this information about the past, I would say, you know. Or certain possibilities are denied them. And so, you know, and I think that the futurity, I mean, if you think about the Sarah, you know, you think about that ceremony, I think that's a future that was only made possible because, or that people think was only made possible, let's put that in quotes, because of this encounter with genetic ancestry testing. So, I mean, it's a lot about, you know, there's a lot here about temporality. I mean, I think there's a great, you know, essay, if not a book, to be written about genealogy and genetics and temporality, and about how it allows us to sort of harness the past, the usable past in different ways. I will say that this kind of Jungian coincidence thing, which I write a little bit about, I mean, I write about a lady who I talked to who says, you know, of course my family is from this, I can't remember what the sort of ethnic group was, a West African community, because she said they are avid potters, and I come from a long line of women in Virginia who are like, throw pots and like weird, like, you know, just the best ceramicists ever. But that claim is not only a sort of past and future and contemporary claim, that's also like, we are great people who do this thing. And to me, there's an implication that that happens into the future. So that part of the, and I think maybe this could be used also for the Queen Elizabeth example, which I'll be thinking about chewing on for a few days, I'm sure, is about, I mean, it's making a claim about the past, but it's also saying like, this is why we will continue to be great, and this is why we continue to be ruling in the future, right? So that you know, and we might say that is kind of containing what is deemed as contamination or stigma, and sort of saying, nor moreover, this, you know, propels this into the future in a way as well, I guess. So I think that there's future play, there's more future play in a lot of this than I think, you know, might appear on the surface. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, that was great. I just wanted to actually invite you to maybe speculate on a solution. If you think that genetic technology has maybe a kind of, to use your words, a symbolic resolution for racial collectives that would be both more oriented in collectivity and also anti-capitalist, do you have any?
Never going to be anti-capitalist. I mean, the whole point is to use others' DNA as a resource for your identity. I mean, that's not like, that's the fundamental, that's the model, right? And so you know, there was a moment, I pulled the slide out actually, at the African burial ground, in which there were some of the scientists who get angry with Rick Kittles for for sort of founding the African Ancestry Company, sort of say, you know, before Rick decides he's going to do this and before it's widely known. So this is sort of like 96, 97, maybe 98. They're saying, well, you know, this is the next frontier of the human rights struggle. Like, we are going to use this technology to, you know, as a kind of sort of common good to sort of help people figure out their identities. But, you know, the model for that doesn't work if you don't have people who are willing to accumulate a reference database and whatever it takes to accumulate. If you don't have people who, at a time when DNA analysis was very expensive, willing to do it, you know, for free. I mean, there were all sorts of just like cost constraints. And then there were all sorts of, I think, epistemological constraints around like, how do you create the reference database, if not through a kind of accumulation that is inherently capitalist in nature. I mean, even if it costs you nothing, like, I don't know how you do that. So I think that there, you know, the folks who understood it as being, you know, the next frontier of the human rights struggle, I think were probably too too rosy and thinking about what the infrastructure, what that would take, that would take to accomplish that. And I think now we're in a place that, I think it's an impossibility. I mean, I think it would take, and we're in a place, if you think about the children who are seeking asylum, where you would have to broker with companies, right, ethical constraints for the project. I mean, it's just, so I don't feel able at this point to speculate about a sort of kind of truly liberatory kind of possibility around this testing. Although I do think, as I said, I mean, there could be ways to imagine 23andMe sort of abiding by the highest ethical standards of, around this, but that still wouldn't do away with the kind of fundamental model of the market. Yeah. So we're at 5. What time do we go to? Do we? Oh, we do? Okay. All right. Fair enough. Right on. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for this. It's fascinating. So I just had kind of like from a bioethical and policy perspective, 2 things about this make me kind of, just the idea of genetic testing in general make me kind of uncomfortable or cautious. One is, I guess this kind of came out in the wake of one of these recent, forensic crossover uses where I forget which one it was, Ancestry or 23andMe said, well, that company was allowing law enforcement to mine their data, but we, covenant that we don't do that. But of course, that begs the question, is that going to be the policy in 5 years or 10 years, and in terms of service subject to change without notice. And then I guess the other kind of even more, pressing uncertainty is that the information itself, the nature of the genetic information that's being collected, almost lends itself to, uses that we can't imagine yet, uses that, in some cases the companies are retaining the data that's associated with the sample. In some cases, I believe they're actually retaining like the sample itself. So, there could be information extracted from that in the future that we can't yet fathom. So, not to avoid alarmism, I guess my question is like, what kind of regulatory or, I guess, some kind of structure that could be devised to try to limit or contain those possibilities going forward, because this is doing, manifest good. But,
Yes, fantastic questions. So what you describe as a company, the company that allowed them access to the data is actually not a company. It's a citizen science project, right? It's a project in which people thought that they were self-organizing around their own, their right to their own DNA samples, that they were uploading of their own volition to a collective science project called GetMatch. So, and it was only a matter of time. And so the thing that's been interesting is that in some of these cases in which, like the BTK or the Grim Sleeper case, there's been a little bit in the Golden State Killer as well, this sort of discourse that, like, well, if people, if you have proximity to criminals, you're going to get caught. There hasn't been a lot of kind of empathy or sympathy around this. But what's become interesting, and the implication was that who was going to be caught up in these, particularly if you're doing the familial searching in which you're looking at forensic databases. So who's going to be caught up in that? And in a carceral society are blacks and Latino families, right? But now that they've made this turn to the genealogical, those are disproportionately European. So now the conversation has been, what does it mean to sort of DNA dragnet European communities who are just naively engaged in citizen science projects, right? So it's been interesting to sort of watch that discourse change around from everyone into the gene pool because like this is how we solve crimes and it's really important to like, oh, there's a kind of disproportionate impact here happening. So it's not only the companies, it's the people are making choices about, and this is where it's also not only about DNA, it's just about data in this moment, about access to their data, and they're making risk calculations based on their experiences and other things. Like, I'm an upstanding citizen, how could this ever, like, it doesn't matter to me if someone gets access to my DNA in a citizen science project, the risks are so low. I mean, you see it also with people like, who are in the Personal Genome Project, who put their whole genome online. I mean, there are people who put their whole genome online as well. These are just sort of profiles. What to say is that, I think that there should rightly be worry, and I think there should be worry, moving to your second point. In my book, I say a couple of things. I say, DNA is the ultimate big data because of its transitive qualities. The intent of the original sample, where the original sample comes from, does not matter, right? It can travel, that data can travel anywhere, and anywhere that people are interested in making claims about human data, that DNA can travel to that. And I think that there was a time, a decade or more ago, where there could have been attempts to make regulatory constraints that would have stopped this. But again, as I said, this is a startup. Disruption was what they were out to do. And so then you had, as we've had, same thing happened with Uber, you have not only regulatory lag, but regulatory confusion. People are much like our presidency. So people are like, you're supposed to do it this way, but nobody's doing it that way anymore. What do we do, And so with direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry, it wasn't clear, so a couple of years into the industry, the FDA had some hearings and they were like, is it our job to regulate this, right? So what's regulated are things like the reagents. There's an agency that regulates the reagents that are used in genetic laboratories, right? There's HIPAA regulations if it's solidly medical genetic information. There's the Genetic Anti-Discrimination Act. That's for genetic privacy, but only in sort of certain settings, right? So it doesn't apply to sort of health insurance, although it applies to discrimination for, life insurance, but not health insurance. And so we are still working in our sort of social domains and regimes around regulation, around how we understand something that requires a field theory, right? There's something that requires a way to understand it that is capacious of the entire social sphere. So I think that you're right, and the causes for concern are there, but they're in some ways related to other causes for concern. Like, what do we do with, it's a similar kind of mechanism, right? People who we thought that we had norms and they're no longer abided, and we don't have an ability to place regulation there. So part of that's about genetics, but also part of that is about this kind of political and social moment. And I agree with you. It is deeply, it's deeply worrisome, and I regret that I don't have any answers for you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this really great talk and for this Q&A also, which I think has been really rich. I wanted to ask a question about how some of this research and the emergence of DNA genealogy might enable, foreclose, and complicate some of our ideas about diaspora. And I'm thinking in particular of the ways that this kind of homogenous idea of Africa has been really politically expedient at different moments in things like Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and is obviously very problematic, but it's also been kind of helpful and useful in some ways. And then I think about the Isaiah Washington example, and he gets this certificate that's from African Ancestry that says Temne and Sierra Leone, and then he's participating in this SARA. And I'm really interested in the ways that that might allow much more specific sorts of identifications, but that those identifications are also, in a sense, as you've been kind of emphasizing through the Q&A, a narrative of sorts, right? That Temne is at best a kind of best guess, and that Sierra Leone, as with most kind of nation states in Africa, is a political construction, right? Like Sierra Leone is a nation state that emerges, that was formerly a colony of former slaves from the British West Indies via Nova Scotia. What does it mean to sort of have those kind of concrete things to hold on to?
Yeah. And
what does that kind of enable and foreclose?
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful question, and it's an important one. So what it forecloses is the sort of Dawsonian linked fate, right? This sort of sense that we share, that we don't need other information because we share a political lived experience that gives us connections across borders, across time, that's sort of political in that way. And I think that's a profound loss, actually, But it makes other things possible, so it makes possible a kind of something close to a remittance culture, like of the type that Iowa Ong writes about, right, in the Chinese diaspora. So there's a sense that somebody used the word responsibility. There's a sense that one has a sense of responsibility and obligation to communities to which one is inferred to be related to. It's certainly the case that there are some African nation states that are creating, so Ghana now has a diaspora visa. That's, I think, a longer term visa for people of African descent, are really sort of mobilizing in the way that India and Israel have kind of ways of sort of linking people into diaspora that's good for a nation state and good for GDP and all of that, even as it's good psychically for folks in the diaspora. I think it, I will say, I loved your point about Sierra Leone, and it's true of other nation states. I mean, one of the questions that I would ask often of the folks that I spent time with is, that Cameroon, or, pick your country, did actually not exist during, before the Middle Passage or before the Scramble for Africa or before, you can pick these various historical markers. And as you say, but it was a thing to hang on to. It was a thing to belong to. If the lack of it, and people, a phrase that was often used is, if the alternative is nothing at all, then I will take this, not certain, this kind of imprecise thing to hang on to. I mean, I haven't had a chance to think about it fully. I think that it's probably a formally new way of thinking about diaspora, but I haven't had a chance to sort of think conceptually, theoretically about what that means. Because it's distinct in that it requires a basis of affiliation where one wasn't required before at all. It's distinct in that depending on how you're using it, there's a kind of litmus test, right? Like, so test, figure out where you're supposed to do your social and economic development. So there's probably something theoretically new there that I just haven't had time and, to capture, but that your question really harkens. So thank you for that. Yeah, Hint.
Thank you, that was wonderful. I have two related questions. One, have you observed and tried to interpret, if you did, what happens if people show up at one of these gatherings and are informed about these genealogy finding techniques? And in one case, one might actually find something, but in another case, one might find nothing. Does one always find something? Does one always find something of significance?
That's a good point, yeah.
And is that somehow morally important? Because I would somehow say, well, it would reinforce my suspicion that a genetic ancestry claim should never inform any moral or social justice claim. Mm-hmm. For example, we would want, certainly after watching The Crown, Queen Elizabeth and the royal house to be welcoming no matter what happened in their tweet, as it were. And relatedly, what is your take on what's happening with an issue that may well decide a next presidential election, namely the way in which Senator Elizabeth Warren decided on not putting to rest or further inflaming the Trumpian slur, characterizing her as Pocahontas, and having, if I'm well informed, decidedly, dismissed the, I think even the offer of taking a genetic test.
Yeah.
Now, is her reasoning that, for the Trump voters, this is not going to matter at all, since no matter of fact it does? Even though paradoxically, I'm it's terrified to think of, if she would be ending up the Democratic nominee and Trump no doubt would be the Republican nominee, we might actually find the decision in the last instance, so to speak, be determined by this very issue.
Fascinating, fascinating. So I guess, okay, so finding nothing. So I spent most of my time with, not exclusively, but almost, but majority with African-American genealogists. And so because the narrative of their experience was that they had nothing, they could not find nothing, right? So because the narrative is that we've lost these identities, so that even if there was something that was banal or not terribly interesting, I mean, in the early days, you are 99% West African. I mean, before there was more kind of thin slicing around, people still found that significant. So I would say that. But there are other kinds of interesting moments. There was a moment, there was a reporter for the online magazine Quartz who, I think about a year ago, she's Korean American who I think she did 23andMe testing. Yes, it was 23andMe. And her result was something like 99% like, East Asian or something, like just something just not, that for her felt like nothing, right? And so the article is about her contacting 23andMe, and she ends up contacting a woman, a biological anthropologist who used to teach at Stanford before she was, probably employee 3 or something at 23andMe, who's a friend of mine named Joanna Mountain. And Joanna, to her credit, says, yeah, I mean, for our Korean sample, has got, there has an N of like 43 or 68 or something, like it was small. But she also said, we think it's actually really powerful. So within that sample, like it's all the same, right? The data is kind of robust in that way. But, so the nothing there was really interesting because, then there was reactions to this article that were like, how can the world's biggest, effectively genetic data company have an N of 68 for anything and say that they're giving somebody a result that's meaningful? So I offer that just as a kind of reaction, not as an answer. So for Senator Ward, I mean, it's a really interesting case for so many reasons. I mean, Kim Tallbear is the work that you want to read if you're interested in indigenous identity and these DNA issues. A couple of things to say. One would be her reaction to not take a DNA test is actually quite consistent with Native American culture around DNA testing. So there's a profound kind of politics of refusal around DNA testing, although we hear the stories of people sort of testing to find out if they're Cherokee, but there's a more pronounced culture of refusal. There's also a culture that says that the DNA does not belong to the individual, and for those for indigenous folks who are tied closely to their communities, that it is the choice of the community or a tribal elder whether or not one can participate in genetic ancestry testing, because what we forget, because we are, liberal individual, neoliberal, sort of whatever, US Americans, is that, and we want to think of ourselves as radically individual, is that a single person's DNA sample always implicates those related to them. It never belongs to you only, right? And so in the early days of 23andMe, I remember, having colleagues say, well, I should talk to my family about it, because what you find out about you has something to say about your parents or your non-parents, if you think about the non-paternity, or your non-bio parents or your siblings and the like. And so what's fascinating is that she's very much operating in a Native American way, orientation to genetic ancestry testing, which is that, it's not determinative of one's identity, indeed that it might not be her choice alone to make. And so, it would be, to see it play out, there wouldn't be, particularly in this moment, an appreciation for that posture. It would only be read as dodging, because we also don't have enough of a public discourse around the foibles of genetic ancestry testing. But yeah, I would offer that. I mean, the other thing I would say, and this is just somewhat tangential, is that there's a really nice piece by a woman named Dina Davis who teaches at Lehigh in the Hastings Center's report, which is about trying to get to a kind of collective bioethics. That bioethics comes out of an individualist kind of philosophical and legal tradition, and she looks at First Nations communities to sort of try to conceptualize a way of thinking about bioethics that would make, the Warren case make sense in a way, and popular discourse in a way that it probably wouldn't and certainly won't in any sort of campaign against Trump.
Yeah. Thank you for a really fascinating talk. There are two moments that really stood out to me in some of the ethnography that you gave us that I wanted to invite you to say more about if it's productive. And one is this statement, "These are my freedom papers."
Yeah.
About the Sierra Leone passport. And I just very interested to hear you say what else you might have to say about that as a kind of diagnosis of politics of the moment in connection with the, I agree, very tragic observation that many of the people you work with, you felt kind of turned from another kind of social justice work to this form of leverage that can be obtained through genetic testing. So that was one. And the other one is about the ceremony for the ancestors that you ended on, and thinking about that in relation to the Mormons, who also made an appearance in your talk, and this wonderful work by an anthropologist named Fenella Cornell, who's written about Mormon kin-making practice.
Oh, really?
So, I mean, it's because the whole Mormon project is about going back and baptizing, saving the souls.
Your genealogy, yeah.
Exactly, that's why they do this crazy genealogy. So, and she's written some beautiful material about this.
Okay, I'll have to make sure I get the correct spelling, because I've been looking for work on this. Great.
But so I'm interested in that aspect in terms of what you found with your interlocutors, to what extent, not just about a place and people, but actual sense that there are, I mean, the language you used for that, the Sarah ceremony was that this was a way of putting the dead to kind of a peaceful rest. So yeah, I was just really interested.
Yeah, so let me see, so I can riff off of that. I mean, I think, in another sort of iteration of this talk, I talk about, so someone asked me, I think he left, about whether or not I had done genetic ancestry testing, and it's the very last ethnographic fieldwork that I do. I did it with great reservation, but I did it because part of what I end up tracking in the book is actually the emergence not only of direct-to-consumer genetics, but the reveal as a kind of social practice. So it becomes, I reach a point in my work where people start to talk about how it's necessary for them to have a reveal. It becomes part of the arc of genetic ancestry testing, and so I write a little bit about a sort of quadrant of YouTube videos that are about people doing their own performance of sending in the sample and doing the reveal, because it becomes sort of part of it effectively. So I end up doing a test, and it's I do a mitochondrial test that is the Bamileke people of Cameroon, to the gentleman who's left, who asked me about that. On that evening, and in another, I don't know if I probably can't get to the slide. Let me see if I can get to the slide on another slideshow. On that evening, when I have my reveal, it's an evening in which it's an event put on by the Leon Sullivan Foundation, and let me see if I did it in Chicago, and I'm told that by Isaiah. This is the night that I'm told that it's his freedom papers. Let me see if I have it here. It's not in this one. And he's standing on a stage later in the evening. Let me see if I can find it. I don't think it might be here. And he's standing on a stage behind a photo of Leon Sullivan, who's holding up one of the passports that he received for dual citizenship for kind of basically doing, here we go, good works on the continent of Africa. And, so the freedom paper thing I came to think about as escapist. in a way. So you can kind of quite tell, but that's Leon Sullivan in a slide on the stage. That's the night Isaiah was carrying that passport in his breast pocket. And Leon Sullivan, because of his good works on the continent of Africa, had, not through genetics, this was long before, but had dual citizenship in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and maybe one or two other places. And I came to think of this as having sort of exit options. I mean, part of it is about wanting to be included and having these places you can be from, but also I think part of it's about places to go to. And with Isaiah, it felt very much about needing to have a place I can get away from and go to. For Isaiah, that might have also been about, his own personal circumstances, which became very complicated in the mid-aughts when he got kicked off of Grey's Anatomy for, for making a bigoted comment about a castmate. So, but yeah, so that's that. And then, the Mormons are, there's really still a book to be written about the Mormon church and genealogy. Part of what makes it possible is Mormon cosmology. So all of the, the people who own, I think it's a consortium of businessmen who own Ancestry.com, for example, are Mormon, of the Mormon faith, and they have sort of licensing deals with the Mormon Church, which has, for decades now, digitized all of these census records, vital records, draft cards that we now can find commonly online on Ancestry.com and other places. So, there was a story about this that is the, there's a rendering of my story that's really about it being the outcome of a Mormon project, sort of come to full fruition. A sort of full, indeed cosmological turn in a larger society that's been sort of actualized around genealogical practice. And the Mormon Church, both in and people, members of the Mormon community, both in their leadership and genetics, and also genetic genealogy, and also genealogy are sort of throughout. I'm not a scholar of religion. Other people I have spoken to who have been in conversation around this project, talking about the Sarah, the Mormon piece, think that there's a really important story about religiosity here to tell. It's just not something I'm good at. But I would love to get the right spelling of the Vanilla Cannell work. That would be great.
It's 6 o'clock is the statutory hour.
Oh, okay.
Please join me in thanking